Before 1900, doctors had not understood why some transfusions caused bad reactions and even death. Landsteiner thought there might be different kinds of human blood. From studying these results, it was found that there are 4 different kinds of human blood, or 4 blood groups. Landsteiner's discovery solved one major difficulty standing in the way of successful blood transfusion, but another remained.
Blood was highly coagulable. The addition of citrate helped maintain the blood in a liquid fashion. Russian physicians pioneered the collection and storage of cadaver blood.
A triumph in the study of blood is a new test that detects the mysterious Rh blood factor.
There are probably hundreds of blood types.
The push to separate whole blood into its individual components really started blood banking.
Blood plasma, a recent and important discovery of medical science, provides a permanent bank for use in transfusion. Furnished by volunteer civilian donors, the blood plasma may be stored indefinitely and given to any patient without risk. Thousands of men and women are donating blood for the Red Cross National Blood Bank to furnish plasma for emergency transfusion.
Researchers are now looking frantically for acceptable and plentiful substitutes for plasma.
Instead of the traditional, easily breakable glass bottle, whole blood to be shipped is today enclosed in unbreakable plastic containers.
Dr. Cooley has done thousands of cases of cardiac surgery without transfusion.
All these men down here, they only get $5 a pint for their blood, but we're striking this blood bank.
You had virtually 100% chance of acquiring hepatitis B from being transfused.
We're going to have 1 million outpatient visits a year from AIDS and AIDS-related illness.
I will do all that God gives us the power to do to find a cure for AIDS.
But now we know every one of us could be devastated by it.
That they had a medication that was infected with the AIDS virus. They took the product off the market in the U.S. and then they dumped it in France, Europe, Asia, and Latin America.
Every time we make blood safe, that step is going to add cost and at the same time may not guarantee us complete protection.
If you get my blood, you will now have my DNA.
So we are dramatically expanding the use of DNA evidence to prevent wrongful conviction.
For the first time in its history, the National Security Council got directly involved in combating a virus, HIV.
The government's scientific committee recommended the use of a filter for transfusion. When is the government going to react to that recommendation?
That recommendation is obviously very important for the future of the blood transfusion service. I will look at it very carefully and I will get back to him.
200 million units of donated blood are needed worldwide. 80 million transfusions are administered each year. The shrinking donor availability means global blood resources are in short supply.
We as physicians have all taken a very basic oath, and that is a Hippocratic oath, and it's to try to do good for mankind, and it also has the corollary of first do no harm.
Above all, do no harm. It makes a lot of sense to think of it as a first principle of healthcare.
When it comes to blood transfusion, it seems as though we have not really understood that, in that we've never done the basic research to know when we're doing good and when we're doing harm.
Many would say, and there is a large worry, that this therapeutic, among the world's most common administered therapeutics, millions upon millions of units transfused worldwide, may make people worse in many instances. And this is a great, great concern.
The scientific evidence has been slow in coming to document the fact that transfusion alters a lot of things in the organism, and it has long-term side effects. It's some kind of very gross modality of treatment. You give a bag of blood, and the bag of blood has all sorts of things in it, and we ignore them.
Blood transfusion came into medical practice virtually through the back door. Normally, therapies or medication used in modern medical practice would have been tried, and then it would be licensed.
Blood transfusion has never undergone randomized clinical trials to the level at which a new drug would have to go through the FDA. It's never been done.
Doctors try a whole lot of stuff, but if they're knowingly harming a patient, and by harm, I think I mean all things considered, the patient is worse off as a consequence of having this intervention, then that's a betrayal of medicine.
My plea to any prospective patient is always to ask why? What is the likelihood that a transfusion will be required? What's going to happen to me either if I have it or if I don't have it?
In the early days of asepsis in Vienna, Austria, Dr. Schimmelweis noticed that the midwives had many fewer infections than did the physicians, who often were touching many different patients or even actually coming from the morgue.
The docs would go from the autopsy room into a delivery room, didn't change the gloves, didn't change the coats, didn't wash their hands, just went from one table to the other. The physicians had a horrible death rate related to post-delivery sepsis of the moms. Same population of moms, midwives were delivering mothers. Their death rate was much less. Schimmelweis goes, well, why are they having less sepsis, less illness and morbidity? And made the simple observation that you need to wash your hands between patients. He introduced that idea to his team and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're just going to wash. Just use regular antiseptic solution and wash, and his moms started surviving at much higher rates. There was no basis for anyone to believe him, plus he was a pretty colorful character apparently as well. And what he was suggesting just sounded outrageous, even though he did have evidence. He had data.
Las observaciones de Semmelweis son observaciones de sentido común. son observaciones de la vida diaria, son observaciones de alguien inteligente que está tratando de ver algo. Y sin embargo, en su tiempo fueron rechazadas, objetadas y su autor perseguido.
He was drummed out of the business, basically, because it was not traditional. The influence of the politics and the fraternity of medical professionals at the time was such that it was simply unacceptable to consider that anything so simple could be the reason for the difference in survival.
People are actually thinking it is all due to demons or devils coming in, till a simple solution Semmelweis brought in of hand washing, and that prevented all this sepsis. So that's a simple solution. So many things in medicine may have a simple solution, but people are reluctant to accept because something is simple.
The Semmelweis principle is the knee-jerk rejection of anything new, because again it challenges the norms.
Now that evolution of that thought of, well, there's a connection here, can I improve outcome, could actually translate into what happens in transfusion.
It serves to illustrate the bias that we physicians have, which is that we really truly believe in what we know, in the way things are done now. And it's the biggest challenge, I think, to practicing physicians, to always be aware of and awake to the possibility that something better is coming along, something new and different, maybe even something contrary to what we believe is the right thing to do. We have to always be open to consider a new idea, even if it flies in the face of everything we think is true.
In the present war, prompt administration of plasma has saved the lives of many victims of explosion burns and lacerations.
There clearly are benefits to transfusion. I've written books about it. I've transfused probably thousands of patients in my career. I know I've saved lives with transfusion. Unfortunately, medicine has taken to heart this public perception of give a unit of blood, save a life.
Every 2 seconds, someone in this country needs blood.
I needed 987 pints of blood to live.
All of the physicians who practice are brought up in the society where they hear, ever since birth, the public relations message of save this child's life, donate a unit of blood. They don't hear the very difficult academic discussion of when to give a unit of blood and when not to.
When you talk to lay people think we know exactly what we're doing and when to start, how much to give, what to give, and when to stop. In fact, from a data-driven fashion, we don't know those things.
We have historically been trained that blood is good. There is nothing but benefit by transfusing patients.
In the healthcare system, blood was something you gave out like you gave out aspirin. It was something we did without even giving it a second thought.
At the moment, a physician can request blood on any patient.
В 70-е годы, я помню, кому мы только не переливали кровь. Там у человека какой-то упадок сил, мы ему назначали переливание крови. Какое-то инфекционное заболевание, мы назначали ему переливание крови. Даже для лечения вот у юноши, которые появляются угри на лице, и то мы применяли переливание крови. Было такое тоже. Это во всем мире было такое.
What has happened over the years is things become embedded in medical practice by tradition. some respected member of the community starts to do something and talks about it with his or her scientific colleagues, and they try it, and it seems to work for their patients, and so gradually the word spreads.
We use this drug or therapeutic transfusion differently than any other therapeutic. We almost never give it to make a person better. That is to say, if we were to give it back freely and restore normal levels, I think most would agree patients would not do well.
Many clinicians think of blood and blood components as a drug to treat specific conditions that patients have.
Blood is a very complex organ that we transfuse as the means of transplanting it.
Now, because of the ability to store and deliver blood on demand, this happens to be the only transplant that all you require is essentially a couple of letters behind your name and a pen, and you can write for it.
A blood transfusion is the only organ transplant that's done by a nurse. Yet a doctor writes it on a piece of paper, a nurse hangs it. It has huge implications for patients.
There's been a tradition in medicine that when people order a unit of blood, they were told by someone, we still don't know who it was and what the reasons were, that if you're going to give a single unit of blood, there's no need to do that, you should give 2. And for many decades, people order units of blood as a couple rather than as single. Every unit has its own risk, and the risks are additive.
When everybody believed that transfusion was safe, it was incredibly easy and straightforward. Everybody could tell you a story of the person who got a 2-unit transfusion and felt immediately better. And everybody wanted to believe, and did believe, that the transfusion was a good thing.
The mindset of most physicians is this is a benign, if not quite beneficial treatment that doesn't cost them anything, makes the patient think that they feel better, they look a little pinker, so it's all okay, because no one's going to ask any questions anyway.
If they're not challenged as to why they want that blood, not challenged as to an alternative therapy, then the blood is made available for them. And it's the line of least resistance.
Tradition and empiricism really, meaning we just started trying it out to see where we could use it and what were the consequences of that. And all of this was done without anybody really saying, you know, shouldn't we study this to see what is the right circumstance for this to be used? How much do you need to give? When should it be given? And it's persisted through till today.
The establishment today would say that you can do pretty well without half of it. And I think the establishment needs to agree that we don't know if you can give it back in most circumstances and help you. So you can basically wait today in many places until you've lost half of your blood before anyone would give it back. It's interesting, right? You can lose half your blood and you don't give it back, and that's because we don't think we can make you better by giving it back unless you've lost at least half of your blood.
And to the nation's 69 schools of medicine is entrusted the responsibility of passing on unbroken the inheritance of medical knowledge, of indoctrinating each young student with the traditions and ethics of his chosen profession. Here he must spend 4 long years.
Really, physicians tend to practice the way they were taught as a young person in medical school. So a new idea has to find its way through essentially 3 stages. First being attacked as being outlandish, and then eventually being accepted, and then finally being taught. Each one of those stages could conceivably take almost a generation, a 20-year turnover of physicians. We don't have some fancy monitor that says, oh, they could use a unit of blood. What we use are surrogate measures, and the most common surrogate utilized is the hemoglobin level, and that's the level of the red stuff in your blood, or the hematocrit, which is the percentage of red blood cells that circulate in the bloodstream.
Back when I was in medical school, really anybody who had a hematocrit less than 35 was transfused. And we deemed success by if we got the hematocrit up to the normal range, 45. That's our only measure of success that we had. And if anybody had symptoms such as they were weak or tired, even if their hematocrit was in the mid-35 range, well, that's not normal. Well, a unit of blood will make them feel better. We were under, I believe, just treating people because that's the way that we were taught, and we never had any evidence-based medicine to suggest that we were doing any good. And more recently, obviously, we were possibly causing harm.
I think it's a good volume expander, and I think that's what we use it for more than anything. It's easy to measure a hemoglobin and see that it's low, give a unit of blood, and you know, 2 hours later you can check a hemoglobin and the hemoglobin is higher. So you feel like you've done something. Has it necessarily benefited the patient? I'm not convinced of that. It's perhaps benefited the people taking care of the patient, because, you know, hemoglobin at time X and then hemoglobin at time Y, and you've seen an appropriate change. The issue is whether that change means anything clinically.
Well, those surrogates are merely laboratory values, and they don't tell us the individualized need of a given patient for blood to be administered.
There are a lot of studies now that show that lower transfusion triggers are just as safe as higher ones, and sometimes even safer.
I have seen a lot of patients with hemoglobin that is very low, like maybe 5, 4, or 3, even as low as 2, and they survive. I have talked to a lot of doctors in the Philippines, and I said, what's your experience with these people with hemoglobins that are low? And they said, yes, they're walking, hemoglobins of 6, hemoglobins of 5. Now, why are these people surviving? Why are these people doing things? They are carrying sacks of rice, they are carrying water, they are farming, hemoglobin of 6 and 7. So there must be a reason to that. A lot of things could really be understood in the light of human physiology.
There's significant variabilities in average hemoglobins amongst different nations on the globe. If you're living up in the Himalayas, your average hemoglobin is going to be high. If you're in sub-Saharan Africa and you're exposed to both malaria and other diseases, your average hemoglobin will be extremely low. Some children run around with hemoglobins below 5 grams in sub-Saharan Africa and are never transfused because there is no blood available. So I think there are significant geographical variabilities, all of which can add to the lesson of how individuals survive under those circumstances.
The history of blood banking and transfusion is really intimately related with injury. if you go back in history, as far back as you go, the first transfusions were related to injury.
In fact, blood as a therapy just sort of happened as a consequence of military. The World War II was really the genesis of blood banking and transfusion practice in this country.
It was out of that Second World War realism of being able to save a life with fresh whole blood that blood transfusion got its good name.
I think it was perceived it was in a bottle, and that was red, life-giving blood that carried oxygen. I don't think anybody knew any of the nuances about whether, storage of blood reduced its oxygen carrying capacity. As far as people were concerned, if you lost the red stuff, you needed the red stuff back.
Today we'd like to pay tribute to the National Blood Donor Campaign with a special program by one of the hardest working entertainment groups in the Far East Command, the Corntones. That's right, we're the Corntones, a bunch of Army Signal Corps officers that kind of let our hair down after duty hours. How about you, Don? When was the last time you visited the blood bank? Oh, gee, Bill, I kind of know my way blindfolded around that place. I go in just about every 2 months. In fact, yeah, here it is. Here's my card, Bill. 7 pints of blood, Don. That's right. In other words, 1 more pint and you'll be qualified as a gallonier. Right. Well, that's something you can well be proud of. How did the rest of the Corntones stack up with you? Oh, Bill, why don't you ask them? How about it? Come in here. Hi, Bill. Dude, what outfit were you with in Korea? I commanded L Company, 38th Infantry Regiment. Don has told me before, Jude, that you were wounded in action in Korea. Did you require any blood? Fortunately, Bill, I didn't. But many of my men required blood. And on their behalf, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for giving your blood. Believe me, you saved a lot of lives.
The belief or the public relations of give a unit of blood, save a life continued on and continued on with the goal of getting the American public to participate and feel altruistic about giving a unit of blood.
Patriotic citizens are giving their blood to save the lives of their soldiers and sailors. 500,000 pints have been donated, and the Red Cross Blood Bank is accepting voluntary contributions at the rate of $2 million a year.
But you got to remember where that was and the context of where that was. That was in battlefield trauma, massive trauma.
It was empirical evidence because you could give blood to a soldier wounded on the battlefield and the soldier survived, and the inference was that it was the transfusion that saved that person's life, therefore that's an indication for transfusion.
Those policies and concepts and thought processes were then implemented in some degree in the civilian community.
I think in the late 40s, early 50s, nobody really understood that there was necessarily problems with blood transfusions. And we didn't understand the infectious disease risks. We certainly didn't understand the lung injury risk. And I'm not sure people fully understood the immunologic risk back then. So I think giving blood was just part of practicing medicine.
Blood transfusion did work to save lives during World War II, when people were bleeding to death on the battlefield. What has happened with many procedures is they go from heroic results in one context to being overutilized.
There was very little science around when should it be used, where should it be used, how much should it be used, who will benefit from this. The 50s and 60s were really uncontrolled. I mean, it was whatever the physician wanted it to be. And physicians assumed a central role in making decisions for patients and did not incorporate patients into those decisions.
I want to make myself clear, Ken. It's within my responsibility to tell Punch.
Don't. I'm warning you, Mark, don't. He's my son.
He's my patient. I'd rather have your okay, but I'm going to do what's best for him in any case.
More than most professions, the medical profession is a culture. Doctors are kind of unique in changing their name when they become members of this culture. They go from being John Jones to being John Jones, MD. It gets attached to their practical identity.
It's very easy to fall into the trap of saying, you know, I know what I'm talking about, therefore you should listen to me. And that's really paternalism in its worst form. Ethically, I think that patients are still being subjected to more paternalism than they should be.
I, working in the United States, of course, see blood married to patriotism, love of country, love of family, love of community. And while clinicians, both nurses and physicians, want to feel that they're above all that, it's the evidence that dictates practice, not any of this other social or cultural stuff. That really isn't true.
I would say that in medicine today, the utilization of blood transfusion has grown into a religion. Today, there are a number of us who are questioning this vision of give a unit of blood, save a life.
I'm interested in the appropriate use of blood, in physicians using as little as possible.
The challenge for us is to make blood make you better, not find a circumstance where giving blood back won't make you worse, which is the current state of the art. An amazing state of the art, I'll tell you, amazing. We give blood in the hopes you won't get worse. Imagine telling a patient, I'm going to give you this stuff, and I hope you won't get worse. And I'm giving it to you because if I don't give it to you, I think you're going to get worse. Now, can I make you better? I don't know about that. Will I make you worse? Maybe.
Ни один спасенный этой кровью боец будет думать с сердечным волнением об этих людях. Сыны и дочери героического советского народа ничего не пожалеют, чтобы вернуть к жизни раненых доблестных воинов, с беззаветной решимостью защищающих каждую пять родной советской земли.
Надо сказать, что, наверное, СССР в этом плане, наверное, было в свое время прогрессивно. То есть, хотя были годы разрухи, 1924 год, всего 7 лет прошло после революции, а уже специальным декретом советской власти были обязаны создаваться банки по заготовке и хранению крови.
Blood banks, as we know them, I would recognize them, really started in World War I. Obviously spurred by all the combat casualties that were coming out, the advent of modern high-velocity weapons, machine guns, and high explosives and artillery, etc., created horrific wounds.
Because of the demands of wartime, which were actually driven by the need to have plasma in a lyophilized form, in a freeze-dried form that could be carried out into the battlefield and then reconstituted just using fluids, that really drove the collection of blood.
The accumulation by the Navy of blood plasma, a recent and important discovery of medical science, provides each ship's sick bay with a permanent bank for use in transfusion. Furnished by volunteer civilian donors through the agency of the American Red Cross, the blood plasma may be stored indefinitely and given to any patient without risk, regardless of his blood type.
Вот, по литературе тоже знаю, что действительно был такой период в истории в СССР, когда рекомендовалось с целью увеличения количества крови заготавливать трупную кровь. Инициатором этого направления был известный очень в то время, это в 30-е годы прошлого столетия, профессор Юдин.
There was an opportunity post-World War II to capitalize on the lessons learned during the war about the ease with which blood could be collected, people's willingness to donate blood. And because all of that was true, there began to be an industry.
I'm the manager of a savings bank with branches all over the country, but we are by no means an ordinary savings bank. In fact, our vaults contain something much more valuable. They contain flasks of life-giving blood and plasma. During 1948, nearly 300,000 men and women will each have given half an hour of their time and 2/3 of a pint of blood to maintain this service. When the blood transfusion service makes an appeal in your district, please volunteer to become a donor. I'm sure some of you here are already regular donors. Thank you, blood donors.
The blood banks, as they became more popular and got implemented into civilian medicine, there was a greater pressure on the blood bank directors and the blood banks to deliver red blood cells to larger and larger civilian elective surgery. Trauma centers started coming in the United States, and the pressures from an inventory management point of view overcame the priorities of clinical outcome associated with these new products.
In the 1950s and 60s, blood transfusion morphed into and away from the utilization of fresh whole blood towards a world in which we started to have just separated red blood cells and other coagulation components.
And frankly, the economic pressures of taking a unit of blood, and if you give that to one patient versus taking that one unit of blood and separating it out into 6 or 7 components that you can give now to multiple patients. Economically, that's a much more beneficial model for a blood bank business, which is what these blood banks are.
I don't know that anybody ever said why. You know, why do you need to transfuse this patient? Instead, the response was, let's make sure we have donors that we can call upon in order to meet that need.
The blood bankers have made the world responsive to the requests and needs of surgeons, anesthesiologists, critical care doctors. So there is always money in the bank. Those physicians who are using the products, the end users of the product, have just simply always got an open checkbook to write and take something out of the bank.
All these men down here, they only get $5 a pint for their blood. How much you go there? $5, but we're striking this blood bank. We're going to take them one at a time. We're asking people to please cooperate with our picket line. We're asking $15 a pint for whole blood, $9 a pint for plasma. We feel it's a struggle for dignity.
The years prior to 1972, where hepatitis B was the biggest threat for blood safety, and since the average transfusion back in the early days was 4 units, you had virtually 100% chance of acquiring hepatitis B from being transfused. Many states enacted legal protection for blood collectors and transfusion practices known as blood shield statutes, which basically said everybody knows you get hepatitis B from a transfusion. So you, the consumer, cannot sue the hospital, the treating physician, or the blood center just because you get hepatitis B. The public felt that blood transfusion was so necessary that the risk of having hepatitis B was just one of those consequences that you would expect to get.
Donation of blood is a source of income for many people in developing countries. There is no control in terms of selection of donors. You got paid, you gave blood, and that was it. So any disease you're harboring certainly could enter into the blood system by delivery to a distribution center.
Number one collector of blood in the Philippines is the Philippine Red Cross. the source of blood is coming from blood banks, commercial blood banks. And the commercial blood banks gets their blood from paid donors who queue up almost like every week to sell their blood. And you can just imagine what kind of people they are. They survive on their blood. They sell their blood. And so you would imagine that these are people who are financially strapped, people who may not have the right nutrition to eat, people who may have diseases in their blood. One can easily understand why complications can really come in. Testing may not be that reliable. And so this is a source of problem.
Only gays and IV drug users were being killed by AIDS. But now we know every one of us could be devastated by it.
With the sudden and unexpected appearance in the early 1980s of a brand new transfusion-transmitted infection, just really set the profession back on its heels.
We now have every day 1,900 people in hospital beds with HIV illness. By 1993, we are going to need 4,000 to 5,000 hospital beds a day. We're going to have 1 million outpatient visits a year from AIDS and AIDS-related illness.
The impact had global consequences. The international distribution of materials, for example, the U.S. was at that time a very large exporter of plasma components for use in hemophiliacs globally. And as a practical matter, as just the financial circumstances of the world, as this knowledge was evolving, plasma that had the HIV virus in it was distributed globally.
That they had a medication that was infected with the AIDS virus. They took the product off the market in the U.S. and then they dumped it in France, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The medicine's called Factor VIII. It was an injection medicine that was used for hemophiliacs, mostly children.
The transmission of HIV was not the only thing that we recognized. We also recognized hepatitis C. And probably, if you looked at transmission of disease, the killer, the largest killer, probably was hepatitis C rather than HIV. So something went wrong with this so-called therapy, if you will, which saved lives.
And the consequence of that subsequent data have shown is that the demand for or the use of blood began to drop. Having physicians not asking for blood to be transfused had no apparent ill effect on patients. In the 80s, stimulated a whole new way of thinking about how to keep blood safe.
While the American people, I think, can take heart from the fact that the nation's blood supply is safer than it has ever been, I must point out that I still have doubts that it is safe as it should and can be. It is the goal of this subcommittee. I believe it is the goal of the Red Cross, and I'm satisfied that it is the drug of the Food and Drug Administration, that we will move forward towards what will ultimately be the safest and the best blood supply for the people of this country.
Beginning in 1996-97, the demand for blood unexpectedly was rising very fast. And in fact, it rose much faster in the 5 years between 1997 and 2002 than the drop that had occurred over the 10 years prior to that time, and it has continued to this day. It's all about the physicians became comfortable that blood was safe again.
The blood bankers have done a fantastic job of eliminating the major risks of hepatitis C and AIDS, HIV. So those risks are vanishingly small, but all that does is uncover all the remaining risks of blood transfusion.
The story about the people from New Guinea and the incidence of cannibalism and the transmission of disease through either transfusing or transplanting or ingesting is one of the issues that makes the blood supply very vulnerable. Kuru is one of those families of the slow neurological diseases that is thought to be transmitted through prion or protein particles. Now that practice of cannibalism has been stopped and the disappearance of disease suggests again very closely that this was related to the ingestions of these particles through cannibalism.
Judy Kenny lost her husband Derek to new variant CJD. He'd been given 4 pints of blood in 1996 during an operation. He died of CJD 6 years later, and it was only because his wife complained they subsequently discovered one of those pints was contaminated.
Variant CJD and so-called mad cow disease, all thought to be prion-derived diseases, or some may be related to slow viruses that attack the central nervous system. And it's not till the last few decades where our understanding of particles rather than just viruses or bacteria has entered into the realm of transmissible disease. These are diseases which are extremely rare, but at the same time, the burden is enormous.
I'm sure the Prime Minister is aware that in percentage terms, the population of United Kingdom and Ireland are the biggest reservoir of the prion that causes the fatal and incurable human brain disease variant CJD. One of the means of transmission is blood transfusion. In October last year, the government's scientific committee looking at this recommended the use of a filter for blood for transfusion for children initially. When is the government going to react to that recommendation? Prime Minister.
This is a very serious matter that he raises in great detail. That recommendation is obviously very important for the future of the blood transfusion service. I will look at it very carefully and I will get back to him.
We are spending in the UK more than 130 million a year in order to prevent this negligible risk.
The safety of the blood supply, such as in the UK with adding filters, is just one step in trying to prevent one particle or one agent in terms of entering into the supply.
And if we introduce the prion filter, I really don't believe in it because, you know, nobody has ever found the prion in patients, in the peripheral blood of patients with variant CJD.
Today, it's £100 million for one agent. Tomorrow, it may be 200 million sterling for another agent. So we will never reach the plateau in terms of making blood safety. There's always going to be something that we're going to need to do to maintain this safety. And of course, that's always going to translate to added costs, which are significant.
I believe that UK blood is much safer. I wouldn't be transfused in the USA. And if I needed a transfusion, I would rather go have a transfusion in the UK.
The UK has probably one, if not the safest, blood supply in the world. What does that mean? That means that from an infectious agents that we are aware of, those have been able to be eradicated or removed from the blood supply. It doesn't make that blood supply not have any implication in terms of non-infectious risks, nor does it protect us from the future in terms of any other organism entering into that blood supply.
So every decade has kind of had its own new set of challenges, and we're still concerned that there are others to evolve.
The cost of a unit transfused in the early stages of the Iraqi war could have exceeded $9,000 per unit.
К сожалению, наверное, как и во всем мире, в России то же самое, увеличивается и увеличивается стоимость одной единицы крови. Если не переливать кровь, то это стоит гораздо дешевле. Если мы, наверное, еще возьмем, мы не считаем, к сожалению, во всем мире считают осложнения, которые могут возникнуть при переливании крови. Если это посчитать, то это, наверное, выйдет в адские деньги. Но мы, к сожалению, пока этого не считаем.
In Australia, when you get a transfusion, on average it's around 2 to 2.5 units. So every time somebody gets a transfusion in Australia, we're going to spend about $2,000. In the US, the estimate is a single unit of blood may cost as much as $1,200 per unit.
When we start looking at not only the cost of allogeneic blood transfusion, but also the negative outcomes associated with transfusion, I think that that's when hospitals start to recognize they're spending an inordinate amount of dollars or yens, wherever you are in the world, yet they're not achieving the relative outcome for that expense.
There is a risk of not being able to continue to maintain an available blood supply for the needs in the future. The ratio of those older persons who we now know receive blood transfusions at about 6 times the rate of the rest of the population, their numbers are growing quickly, so the ratio between older people being transfused and those donating blood is in fact declining quickly.
The need of blood increases continuously due to demographic changes. 20 years ago, nobody operated on patients with 80 years, but today this is routine.
There is a shortage, an acute shortage in the bank when you talk about voluntary donors. They are obviously shrinking all over the world, and definitely in areas where HIV endemicity is high. It's difficult to get donors. Then, of course, it's expensive. Those who have relatives or friends who are willing to donate for them, then they bring them along.
As blood's got safer, it seems to have got scarcer. And therefore, as haematologists, we've had to consider how best to use blood, but also what are the alternatives that we can use.